in the depths of stone chambers where daylight never reached, where the air hung thick with incense and terror. A different kind of prayer echoed through medieval Europe, not the gentle murmur of evening vespers, but the desperate bargaining of souls stretched between salvation and damnation. The torches cast dancing shadows on walls blackened by centuries of smoke and screams. Iron instruments hung from hooks like twisted crucifixes, the strappado, the wheel, the pair of anguish. Each tool blessed by men who believed they served God's will. Each pain inflicted in the name of purifying the soul. Here, in rooms that smelled of burning flesh and desperate tears, the Inquisition conducted its holy work. Here, faith became fire, justice became torture, and salvation demanded confession, no matter the cost. The year was 1484. Pope Innocent VIII had just issued his papal bull, Summis Desiderantes Effectibus, declaring war on witchcraft across Christendom. Heinrich Kramer was preparing his Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches, a manual that would guide the hunting and breaking of accused heretics for centuries to come. This is the story of when faith burned brightest and darkest, when the promise of eternity justified any earthly agony, when the Church, in its quest to save souls, instead consumed them in flames, both literal and metaphorical. Welcome to the sacred tortures of the Inquisition. The Inquisition did not begin as an instrument of mass terror. It emerged in the 13th century as the Church's response to growing heretical movements across Europe, the Cathars in southern France, the Waldensians in the Alps, groups that challenged papal authority and Catholic doctrine. Pope Gregory IX established the first inquisitorial courts in 1231, placing them under the Dominican order, those hounds of God whose motto was to praise, to bless, to preach. But praise quickly became persecution. Blessing became brutality. The inquisitors arrived in towns like harbingers of Judgment Day. They announced a period of grace, 30 to 40 days during which heretics could confess voluntarily and receive lighter punishment. Those who came forward faced penance, pilgrimages, fines, the wearing of yellow crosses sewn onto their clothing. But those who remained silent, who hoped to escape notice, faced something far worse when the grace period ended. The machinery of accusation was elegant in its simplicity. Anonymous denunciations were not only accepted but encouraged. A whispered word, a neighbor's suspicion, a business rival's grudge, all became pathways to the inquisitor's chamber. The accused had no right to face their accusers, no right to legal counsel in the modern sense. They entered a labyrinth of canonical law where the presumption of innocence had been replaced by the certainty that where there was smoke, there must be fire. Brother Bernard Gui, the most notorious inquisitor of Toulouse, perfected the art of spiritual interrogation. In his manual, the Practica Inquisitionis, he outlined techniques that would echo through centuries. Begin gently, he advised. Speak of God's mercy. Offer the comfort of confession. But if gentleness failed, if the accused maintained their innocence, then the inquisitor must remember that the soul's salvation justified the body's suffering. The courtrooms themselves were designed to intimidate. High stone walls, religious imagery depicting the torments of hell, and always, the presence of the instruments. The accused would see them before any questions were asked, a psychological preparation for what might come. The message was clear: confess willingly, or confession would be extracted. By the 15th century, the Spanish Inquisition had refined these methods to a terrifying efficiency. Under Tomás de Torquemada, the system expanded beyond heresy to encompass conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly maintaining their faith. The paranoia was infectious. Trust dissolved. Communities turned inward, watching, waiting, whispering. The holy court of terror had found its rhythm, and Europe would dance to its deadly tune for centuries to come. The theology of torture rested on a foundation of twisted logic that medieval churchmen found unshakable. If the soul was eternal and the body temporary, then any physical suffering that led to spiritual salvation was not only justified, it was merciful. This was the gift of pain, the sacred violence that freed the spirit from the flesh's stubborn refusal to confess the truth. The inquisitors drew their authority from canon law and papal decree. The bull ad extirpanda, issued by Pope Innocent IV in 1252, gave explicit permission for the use of torture in heresy cases, with the caveat that it not cause death or permanent injury. This legal fig leaf would cover centuries of calculated cruelty. The process began with what they called showing the instruments. The accused was led into the chamber where the tools of confession awaited. The sight alone broke many. The strappado, a rope and pulley system that dislocated shoulders as victims were hoisted by their bound arms, the rack, which stretched bodies until joints separated with audible pops, the water torture, where cloth was forced down the throat while water was poured over the face, creating the sensation of drowning. Isabella of Montpellier learned these lessons in 1243. Accused of Cathar sympathies, she maintained her innocence through hours of gentle questioning. When they brought her to see the instruments, she collapsed in terror. When they bound her arms for the strappado, she begged for mercy. When they began to hoist her, her shoulders screaming in protest, she confessed to heretical beliefs she had never held, named companions who had never existed, and wept as she sealed the fate of innocence with her forced testimony. The church lawyers had crafted careful restrictions around torture's use. It could only be employed once per case. But the inquisitors found creative interpretations. If torture was interrupted and resumed on another day, was that really a second time? If new evidence emerged, could the process begin fresh? The letter of the law was preserved while its spirit was systematically violated. Margaret of Cambrai faced the wheel in 1317. Bound spread-eagle to the wooden circle, she felt her limbs stretch and strain as the device slowly turned. The pain built gradually, a deliberate choice. Quick agony might render the victim unconscious. Slow, mounting pressure kept them aware, able to confess, able to name others. When Margaret finally broke, she implicated 17 women in her village, sparking a wave of arrests that consumed the community like wildfire. The records of confession were meticulously kept. Every admission, every name, every detail was carefully transcribed. These documents would become evidence in new cases, creating an ever-expanding web of guilt. A single tortured confession could destroy dozens of lives, each new arrest bringing fresh opportunities for extraction of testimony. Pain became the Church's truth serum, and under its influence, any story became. In 1487, Heinrich Kramer published a book that would become the best-selling manual of persecution in European history. The Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, was part theological treatise, part legal guide, and part instruction manual for identifying, prosecuting, and executing those accused of witchcraft. It was the codification of centuries of misogyny, wrapped in the language of salvation. Kramer had tasted failure before his literary triumph. His attempts to conduct witch trials in Innsbruck had been so excessive that the local bishop expelled him from the diocese. But rather than retreat, Kramer doubled down, creating a systematic approach to witch hunting that would transcend any single inquisitor's jurisdiction. The Malleus established 3 fundamental premises. Witches existed. They posed a mortal threat to Christendom, and they were predominantly female. This last point was crucial. Women, Kramer argued, were naturally more susceptible to demonic influence because of their weaker nature, their carnal desires, and their inherent credulity. The witch became the ultimate expression of feminine evil, sexually deviant, spiritually corrupted, and physically dangerous. The book provided detailed instructions for every aspect of witch prosecution. How to identify suspects through physical examination, searching for the devil's mark, any mole, birthmark, or blemish that might indicate supernatural alliance. How to conduct interrogations, beginning with gentle persuasion before escalating to torture. How to extract confessions that would implicate others, spreading the investigation like ripples on a pond. Anna Ebeler of Würzburg discovered the power of the hammer in 1628. Accused by a neighbor of cursing his cattle, she found herself facing questions that seemed designed to trap her regardless of how she answered. Did she know the accused witches of the previous year? If she said no, she was lying. How could she not know such notorious criminals in a small town? If she said yes, she was clearly part of their conspiracy. Had she ever spoken words of anger against her neighbors? Every human being had done so, but under interrogation, angry words became curses. Frustration became malevolent magic. The torture followed predictable patterns. Anna was stripped and searched for the devil's mark. When examiners found a small mole on her shoulder, she was declared proven guilty. Under torture, she confessed to attending sabbats, consorting with demons, and casting spells that had killed children and blighted crops. More importantly, she named 17 other women as her accomplices. The efficiency was breathtaking. Each confession created new cases. Each new case yielded more. Prince Bishop Julius Ector of Würzburg embraced Kramer's methods with enthusiasm. Between 1626 and 1631, his territories experienced one of the most intensive witch hunts in European history. Over 900 people were executed: men, women, children, clergy, nobles, and peasants. The hammer fell on all social classes, all ages, all levels of society. Even Ector's own nephew was consumed by the fire he had helped to kindle. The book's influence spread far beyond Catholic territories. Protestant regions adopted its methods, proving that the appetite for persecution transcended denominational boundaries. The hammer had become Christendom's shared weapon against the darkness they claimed threatened them all. At the intersection of medieval theology and ancient misogyny, the witch hunt found its perfect victim, the woman who stepped outside prescribed boundaries. The Inquisition's treatment of accused witches revealed deep currents of fear about female sexuality, independence, and power that ran through European society like underground rivers of poison. The theological framework was clear. Women were daughters of Eve, inheritors of original sin, more susceptible to temptation and corruption. When Dominican Inquisitor Johannes Nieder wrote his Formicarius in 1437, he established the template that would define witch persecution for centuries. Women were weak, he argued, more easily seduced by demonic promises. Their carnality made them natural allies of Satan. Their tongues made them spreaders of corruption. But the reality was more complex and more revealing. The women who faced inquisitorial courts were often those who challenged social norms in ways that threatened established power. Midwives who knew too much about birth and death. Healers who practiced traditional medicine that competed with clerical authority. Widows who controlled property. Unmarried women who lived independently. Accused witches were frequently women who had gained knowledge, influence, or independence that made others uncomfortable. Marguerite Porete learned this lesson fatally in 1310. A French mystic and author, she had written The Mirror of Simple Souls, a spiritual work that argued for direct communion with God without clerical intermediation. Her book was burned in 1306, but Marguerite continued to distribute copies and teach her ideas. When she was brought before the Inquisition, she refused to answer questions or recant her beliefs. Her silence was interpreted as demonic obstinacy. Her learning was evidence of supernatural aid. Her mystical claims were proof of heretical delusion. She was burned at the stake in Paris, her ashes scattered to prevent any veneration. The sexualization of witchcraft accusations became a powerful tool of control. The witch's sabbat, as described in inquisitorial manuals, was explicitly sexual, a orgiastic gathering where women submitted to demonic lovers and participated in obscene rituals. These fantasies revealed more about the accuser's fears and desires than about any actual practices, but they served their purpose, reducing complex spiritual and social conflicts to narratives of female sexual deviance. Agnes Waterhouse of Hatfield Peveril became England's first woman executed for witchcraft in 1566. Her crime, owning a white-spotted cat named Satan that allegedly performed magical tasks at her bidding. The absurdity of the charge masked deeper anxieties about an elderly woman living alone, supporting herself through small, magical services for neighbors, refusing to conform to expectations of female dependency and deference. The examination of accused witches often included forced nudity, searches of intimate body parts for, quote, devil's marks, and interrogations about sexual relationships with demons. These procedures, conducted by male church officials, represented a systematic violation that was itself a form of torture, designed to humiliate and break the spirit before physical pain even began. Barbara Goebel of Würzburg faced such examination in 1629. Stripped naked before a panel of clergy and secular officials, her body was examined with needles and pins, searching for spots that would not bleed when pierced, the supposed sign of demonic marking. When no such marks were found, the examiners declared that Satan had made them invisible, proving her guilt more certainly than visible signs would have. Under torture, she confessed to sexual congress with demons, to murdering infants, to causing storms and crop failures. She named other women before her execution, ensuring the cycle would continue. The witch hunt had become a mechanism for controlling female autonomy, using the language of spiritual salvation to justify the systematic persecution of women who threatened established order. In the name of protecting Christian society from supernatural threats, the Inquisition had created its own very real terror. The Protestant Reformation did not end the witch hunts, it intensified them. As Christian Europe fractured along denominational lines, both Catholic and Protestant authorities found in witchcraft accusations a powerful tool for consolidating control and demonstrating theological purity. The competing claims to religious truth created an atmosphere of spiritual warfare where accusations of demonic alliance became weapons in sectarian conflict. Martin Luther himself contributed to the persecution. In his table talk, he declared that witches should be killed without mercy, arguing that they had made pacts with Satan that placed them beyond human redemption. "I would burn all witches," he proclaimed, "for they are incarnations of the devil." His theological revolution, which emphasized individual relationship with God, paradoxically created new fears about individual corruption and demonic influence. The most devastating witch hunts occurred in territories where religious authority was contested. The Holy Roman Empire, fragmented into competing Catholic and Protestant principalities, became a laboratory of persecution. Prince Bishop Gottfried Johann Georg Fuchs Dornheim of Bamberg orchestrated one of the most intensive campaigns, burning over 1,000 accused witches between 1626 and 1631. His executioners worked with industrial efficiency, constructing a special building, the Witch House, designed specifically for interrogation and torture. In Protestant Scotland, King James VI, later James I of England, personal encounter with witchcraft accusations shaped royal policy for generations. In 1589, severe storms delayed his return from Denmark with his new bride, Anne. Local authorities arrested nearly 100 people, accusing them of raising the tempest through witchcraft. James personally supervised some interrogations, becoming convinced of a vast conspiracy against his throne. The North Berwick witch trials that followed revealed the extent to which political paranoia and supernatural fears had merged. Agnes Sampson, a midwife and healer, was subjected to torture that included sleep deprivation, the application of iron devices called witches' bridles that prevented speech, and the searching of her body with needles. Under this torment, she confessed to attempting the king's murder through magical means and implicated dozens of others in the conspiracy. James documented his experiences in Demonology, published in 1597, which became an influential manual for witch hunting across Protestant territories. The book's combination of royal authority and personal testimony gave it credibility that purely clerical works lacked. When James ascended the English throne in 1603, his beliefs shaped English law, leading to the witchcraft statutes that would govern persecution for decades. The Salem witch trials of 1692 to 1693 represented the Protestant witch hunt's final, frenzied expression in the New World. The Puritan community of Salem Village had been torn by factional disputes, economic tensions, and fears about their spiritual status. When young girls began exhibiting strange behaviors, the community found an explanation that satisfied their theological worldview, while providing scapegoats for their accumulated anxieties. Bridget Bishop faced the accumulated weight of Protestant witch-hunting tradition when she was accused in Salem. Her past: she had been married 3 times, ran a tavern, wore fashionable clothing, and had a reputation for sharp speech, made her a perfect target. Under interrogation, her denials were interpreted as demonic stubbornness. When the afflicted girls writhed in apparent agony at her presence, the spectral evidence was deemed sufficient for conviction. She was hanged on June 10, 1692, the first of 20 executions that summer. The Protestant emphasis on Scripture alone, sola scriptura, had created its own interpretive challenges. Biblical passages about not suffering a witch to live, Exodus 22:18, were taken as divine commandments requiring human enforcement. The absence of traditional Catholic rituals for dealing with supernatural threats left Protestant communities feeling vulnerable, dependent on civil authorities to cleanse their communities of demonic influence. Ironically, the Reformation's promise of spiritual liberation had created new forms of religious oppression. proving that the capacity for sacred violence transcended denominational boundaries. By the 17th century, the persecution of witches had evolved into something that transcended religious ideology. It had become a technology of social control, a means of enforcing conformity through terror sanctified by faith. The machinery of accusation, torture, and execution operated with bureaucratic efficiency, creating a self-sustaining system that fed on fear and justified itself through divine authority. The economics of witch hunting revealed its true nature. Accused witches and their families bore the costs of their own persecution, paying for their imprisonment, feeding their guards, purchasing the wood for their execution pyres. Property was confiscated to cover expenses, creating financial incentives for authorities to pursue cases aggressively. In Würzburg, Prince Bishop Julius Ector accumulated massive wealth from confiscated estates, using witch hunt profits to fund palace construction and territorial expansion. The psychological dynamics were equally calculated. Communities under stress, facing plague, famine, economic upheaval, or military threat, found in witchcraft accusations an explanation for their suffering that absolved human authorities of responsibility while providing clear targets for retribution. The witch became a vessel for collective anxiety, a figure onto whom all fears could be projected and through whose destruction communities imagined they could restore order. Matthew Hopkins, England's self-proclaimed witch-finder general, demonstrated how individual entrepreneurs could exploit these dynamics for personal gain. Operating during the chaos of the English Civil War, 1645-1647, Hopkins traveled through East Anglian villages offering his services in identifying witches. His methods combined traditional torture techniques with innovative approaches: sleep deprivation, forced marching until suspects collapsed from exhaustion, and the swimming test, where suspected witches were bound and thrown into water. Hopkins' victims included elderly women, like Elizabeth Clark of Manningtree, who was kept awake for 4 consecutive nights until exhaustion and terror made her confess to consorting with demons. Her confession implicated 32 others, creating a cascade of accusations that consumed entire communities. Hopkins charged fees for each witch identified, making persecution profitable while cloaking his enterprise in religious duty. The continental witch hunts had reached industrial scales in some regions. In the Franconian territories of Germany, the persecution became so intensive that entire villages were depopulated. Children as young as 7 were accused and executed. The Prince Bishop of Bamberg's records show executions of his own relatives, clergy, and court officials. The accusations had escaped any bounds of reason or restraint. Maria Anna Singer faced the full machinery of sanctified violence in 1754 in Bavaria, one of the last major witch trials in German territories. Accused of causing crop failures through magical means, she endured torture sessions that were meticulously documented by court officials. The transcripts reveal the systematic nature of her persecution, each confession leading to new questions, each admission of guilt requiring additional details, each naming of accomplices generating fresh warrants for arrest. The religious justification remained constant throughout centuries of persecution. Inquisitors and witch hunters consistently presented their work as necessary for the salvation of souls and the protection of Christian society. They genuinely believed, or claimed to believe, that they served God's will by rooting out demonic corruption. This conviction allowed them to perpetrate horrors while maintaining their sense of righteousness. The witch hunt had become institutionalized violence, a system where religious authority, political power, economic incentive, and social control converged to create a machine that consumed human lives while claiming to serve divine justice. It was perhaps the most successful example of how faith could be weaponized to serve secular purposes while maintaining sacred legitimacy. The smoke that rose from execution pyres carried more than ashes. It carried the essence of what happens when religious conviction combines with unchecked power to create systematic oppression. The end of the witch hunts did not come suddenly, like a candle extinguished by wind. Instead, the great persecution died slowly, consuming itself through its own excesses and contradictions, until even its most ardent supporters could no longer ignore the carnage wrought in heaven's name. The turning point arrived not through sudden enlightenment, but through exhaustion. Communities that had torn themselves apart through accusations found themselves bereft of victims and traumatized by the very violence they had once embraced. In Salem, the trials ended abruptly when accusations began targeting the wives of prominent ministers and government officials. The spectral evidence that had condemned 20 people to death suddenly seemed unreliable when it threatened the accusers themselves. Reverend Increase Mather, one of New England's most influential Puritan leaders, published Cases of Conscience in 1693, arguing that spectral evidence was insufficient for conviction because Satan might appear in the form of innocent people to deceive observers. His son, Cotton Mather, who had initially supported the trials, began expressing doubts about the proceedings. When those in power questioned the methods, the entire system collapsed within months. In Europe, the process was more gradual but equally inevitable. Legal reforms slowly raised the standards of evidence required for conviction. The requirement for multiple witnesses, independent corroboration of accusations, and restrictions on the use of torture created procedural barriers that made successful prosecutions increasingly difficult. The last major witch hunt in Catholic Europe occurred in Poland, where Father Benedict Chmielowski conducted trials in Sandomierz as late as 1740. Even then, the proceedings faced criticism from church hierarchy and civil authorities. When 14 people were executed following his investigations, the scandal reached Rome itself, leading to formal condemnation of his methods. Anna Goldie faced the final flames of the witch hunt era in 1782 in the Swiss canton of Glarus. Employed as a domestic servant in the household of magistrate Johann Jakob Schude, she was accused of bewitching his young daughter. The trial was conducted in secrecy, without proper legal representation, using procedures that had been abandoned elsewhere for decades. Her execution by hanging on June 13, 1782, marked the last known judicial execution for witchcraft in Europe. Goldie's case revealed how the witch hunt tradition persisted in isolated communities long after intellectual elites had abandoned belief in malevolent magic. Local authorities, faced with unexplained illness or misfortune, still reached for familiar explanations and familiar solutions. But the wider world no longer supported such approaches. Goldie's execution prompted criticism from across Europe, making the authorities in Glarus objects of ridicule rather than respect. The scientific revolution had provided new frameworks for understanding natural phenomena that had previously been attributed to supernatural causes. The Age of Enlightenment emphasized reason over revelation, skepticism over faith, and individual rights over community conformity. Figures like Voltaire ridiculed witch hunting as superstitious barbarism, while legal reformers like Cesare Beccaria argued against torture and capital punishment on humanitarian grounds. But perhaps most importantly, the witch hunts died because they had achieved their purpose. The Great Persecution had successfully eliminated alternative spiritual practices, consolidated religious authority, and enforced social conformity through terror. The threat that witches supposedly represented, to Christian orthodoxy, to social order, to masculine authority, had been neutralized not because actual witches had been destroyed, but because the communities that might have sheltered alternative beliefs had been traumatized into silence. The institutional framework for persecution remained in place long after executions ended. Laws against witchcraft stayed on the books for decades or centuries after the last trials. The Witchcraft Act was not repealed in England until 1951. The psychological legacy persisted even longer. The fear of accusation, the suspicion of neighbors, the understanding that deviation from accepted norms could prove fatal. Maria Barbera, executed in Sicily in 1788, was among the very last judicial victims of the European witch hunt. Her death marked not just the end of an era, but the conclusion of humanity's longest sustained campaign of religious persecution. The fires had finally burned out, leaving behind ash, memory, and the sobering knowledge of what mortals could do to each other when convinced they served immortal purposes. In village squares across Europe, memorial stones now mark the sites where execution pyres once blazed. The names carved into granite and marble represent only a fraction of those consumed by the Great Persecution. Historians estimate that between 40 and 60,000 people died in the witch hunts, though the true number will never be known. Many records were lost, many deaths went undocumented, many victims were erased from history as thoroughly as they were erased from life. But numbers cannot capture the true legacy of the witch hunts. For 3 centuries, European communities lived under the shadow of accusation. Children learned to fear their grandmothers' folk remedies. Healers abandoned their practices. Women learned silence. Men learned suspicion. The social fabric was rewoven with threads of mistrust and terror that would persist for generations. The Inquisition claimed to serve God's justice, but it served human power. It claimed to save souls, but it destroyed lives. It claimed to protect Christian society, but it tore communities apart. The sacred tortures inflicted in religion's name revealed not divine will, but human capacity for self-deception and cruelty. The witch hunt ended not because humanity grew wiser, but because it had served its purpose. The old ways were broken. Alternative beliefs were eliminated. Female independence was crushed. Social conformity was enforced. The persecution stopped when there was nothing left to persecute, and no one left with the courage to be different. Today, we tell ourselves that such things could not happen again, that we have learned the lessons of history, that reason has triumphed over superstition. But the machinery of accusation remains unchanged. Only the categories of otherness shift. The capacity for communities to turn on their members, for authorities to exploit fear, for ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil, has not been eradicated by time or progress. The witch hunters believed absolutely in their cause. They saw themselves as warriors of light, battling creatures of darkness. They crafted elaborate theologies to justify their actions and detailed procedures to sanctify their violence. They were not monsters but human beings, which makes their story not a historical curiosity, but a warning. The stones marking execution sites bear witness not just to those who died, but to those who killed. They remind us that the greatest horrors are not born from evil intentions, but from good ones corrupted by power, fear, and certainty. They speak to the danger of believing so completely in our righteousness that we lose sight of our humanity. They called it justice. They believed it was holy. But the smoke that rose from those fires carried more than ashes. It carried the memory of what fear can